Hello and welcome to this video on the Exodus route in a nutshell. In this short video I'm going to give my opinion as to what works and doesn't work in relation to plotting the route of the Exodus. Now the Bible tells us that the Israelites went first to Mt Sinai before they went to the Promised Land. Now we have several verses shown here that establish that Mt Sinai was in or close to Midian, which virtually all scholars agree was in Saudi Arabia. It was not on the Sinai Peninsula. In his book, The Exodus Mysteries of Midian, Sinai and Jabal al-Lawz, Glenn Fritz provides several geographical reasons for choosing Jabal al-Maqla in the Jabal al-Lawz range as the best candidate for Mount Sinai in the land of Midian. To determine the way that they went to Mount Sinai, we need to know where God parted the Red Sea. Now there are several Bible verses, and not just poetry but narrative prose as well, that shows that there is great emphasis on the waters that Israel crossed as being very deep. Now this doesn't fit the very shallow ancient lakes, which are only a few meters deep along where the Suez Canal is today. Now God was not doing a waterboarding session in shallow waters, and if he were, Josephus puts the number of Egyptian soldiers at 250,000. Now, if the crossing took place in such shallow water as these border lakes, there should be plenty of remnants in these lakes of where this great army lost their lives, yet nothing has ever been discovered at any of these lakes. Now the Bible also tells us that the wilderness shut the Israelites in where God parted the Red Sea. Josephus is clear as crystal that it wasn't coastal topography, but mountainous terrain that shut them in. Now these 2 points appear to rule out the Egyptian border lakes. Now those points also, I believe, rule out 2 theories of crossings over an ancient riverbed that fed into the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, or an ancient lake further north near Timnah. Now the mountains on the western side at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba go right to the sea just south of Eilat. A crossing could only take place right near the very top, and then you would have the problem as well of the Egyptians being able to go around the head of the Gulf to meet the Israelites on the other side. Now if we go over to the Gulf of Suez, only one place has mountains to trap the Israelites in and is narrow enough for them to cross in one night, and that is the Western Peninsula just south of Suez. Now any further north has no mountains if it did extend further north back then, and the only places that they could access further south are too wide to cross in a single night. At that Western Peninsula, the mountains don't go all the way to the sea, and the Egyptians could go around the southern end of those mountains, so the pillar of fire would have to be at both the north and the south to prevent the Egyptians getting to the Israelites, not to mention the problem of them going around the head of the Gulf to the other side where the Israelites were crossing to. Now the one thing that impresses me the most about Stephen Rudd's Exodus route down the Western Sinai, across the Straits of Tiran and then onto Mount Sinai, is that the route on both sides is mostly flat and wide and ideal for such a multitude to traverse. Now that said, I'm actually reminded of Jesus' own words about the wide road and the narrow path, so all the clues have to be factored in when determining the crossing site. Now the road down the Sinai Peninsula bends around the southern end of the peninsula, but it's not really a turn because it's basically still the same road. Now Stephen Rudd believes that the turn is a U-turn back from where the mountains go all the way to the sea, just north of the southern tip of the peninsula. Now I have reason to doubt this because it's actually God who's doing the leading of the Israelites. Now can you imagine the pillar of fire going beep, 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 beep as it's reversing? I mean, you can just imagine the complaining Israelites saying, oh great, even God doesn't know where he's going. Now it would make much more sense on God's part to have them camp at the crossing site and then arrange to send some scouts who would report back to them that it was a dead end. Now there's also the problem of the very steep gradient of the strait when stripped of water. And according to my information, there's also great sharp coral beds in parts of this proposed crossing site. Now, midway down the Gulf of Aqaba, there is this enormous beach called Nawaiba. Now, the only way to it is through Wadi Watir, which fits Josephus' description of how they could have been trapped by the Egyptians as they came down the wadi. Now, while very deep at this location, the gradient at this proposed crossing site is actually quite modest at 7 degrees for the whole way down and up again. Now, some of the modest finds of corals with circles and right angles and a nondescript pillar at this location, which really is just a dead end at the end of Wadi Watir, add to the overall likelihood that this was the crossing site. Now, as spectacular a miracle as it would take to cross, this is the one location that best fits the clues. For the crossing to have occurred at any other location, such as the Border Lakes, would require rejecting some of the biblical clues and saying that the Bible is part true and part false. Now, Nawaiba Beach is 5 miles or 8 kilometres from north to south, and the waters were probably that far apart, with plenty of room for all to make the crossing. Now, across the 15 miles at 2 miles an hour, it would take around about 7 to 8 hours to cross. In Exodus 15 verse 8, Moses says that the depths were congealed. The Hebrew word for congealed here means to thicken or make solid like ice. Now, I believe that God didn't use a wind when he initially parted the waters, but once parted, he then used a strong east wind to freeze the giant walls of water on either side. Now, this was the purpose of the strong east wind, to keep the walls frozen like Superman's icy breath would. That super strong wind was only on the two sides, and God would have made sure that it was calm for most of the 5-mile path in between. Now, after they crossed the Red Sea, they went through the wilderness of Shur. Now, there's a well-known wilderness of Shur to the east of the Great Bitter Lake, which works for a Border Lakes or Suez crossing, but not a crossing over the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, this is the strongest point against the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, the name Shur means wall or barrier, which has a fairly generic meaning. Glenn Fritz makes a good case for the mountain range that goes from Edom down to Midian as being called Shur. Now, Shur is mirrored in the Arabic name El Hijaz for this range, which means the barrier. Now, those who support a Border Lakes crossing might scoff at this suggestion of a second wilderness of Shur. However, Border Lakes theorists are essentially proposing the same thing with regards to one of the Border Lakes being called Yam Suf, the Hebrew words that are translated Red Sea. The only body of water that without question is called Yam Suf is the Gulf of Aqaba, as noted in 1 Kings 9, where Solomon built a naval base. For one of the Border Lakes to be the crossing site requires there to be multiple Yam Sufs. Now, the translation of Reed Sea for Yam Suf does not work for the Gulf of Aqaba, which doesn't have reeds. So this makes it highly unlikely that Sea of Reeds is the correct translation for the Yam Suf that was crossed. Now, if Nawaiba is the correct crossing site, there are 4 possible ways to get to Mt Sinai. Now, one would be to go north, then find a suitable wadi to ascend, then go south. However, this does not match the clues of the journey. They go to an oasis called Elim, and then after that there is a camp at the Red Sea again. Now, going north, there is no candidate for Elim unless you ascend up the coastal range. And then it makes no sense to go back down to the Red Sea. Now, according to Glenn Fritz's information, the direct route shown here in blue is theoretically possible for a multitude to travel. However, it does not match the clues of the journey as well. There is no oasis candidate for Elim along this path, and then there is no second Red Sea encampment. Now, while God could have taken him the direct way. He instead chose a longer way. Now, one reason may have been to test the Israelites. Now, Josephus' account indicates that the collecting of the weapons of the Egyptians was likely the purpose for the second Red Sea encampment. Ron White's route is shown here on this map in purple. Now, he has them going south, ascending up very tight mountainous terrain and then going to an oasis close to the Red Sea before heading northeast through the wilderness of Sin to the famous split rock on the western side of the Jabal al-Law's range, and then going around the northern side of the range to its eastern side. Ron White's proposed Elam site is actually quite small and lacks a suitable exit route to reach the second Red Sea encampment. Glenn Fritz proposes Elam was a wider geographic area in and near the wadi just further south, the broad wadi called Wadi al-Hamad, and the wells and the well-vegetated area in Al-Bad. Now, the main difference between Glenn Fritz's and Ron White's routes is the difference in distance that they cover after they reach the wilderness of Sin. Now, according to the Bible, it took them a month to go from Egypt to the wilderness of Sin, which Ron White places on the western side of Mount Sinai. Yet, according to his view, it took them almost the same amount of time to do the far shorter distance, going around to the other side of the mountain on its eastern side. Now, this argues very strongly in favour of them going south and not north after reaching Elam and the second Red Sea encampment. Now, this to me is the best evidence for the rather circuitous route to the south to the next pass that is navigable by a multitude. Now, this would also rule out the Israelites going by the way of the famous split rock on the western side of the Jabal al-Law's range, as much as it pains me to rule it out as the Rock of Horeb, since it looks so spectacular. Glenn Fritz proposes a basalt peak called Al-Batra, where the Israelites ascended the high plateau on the eastern side of the mountains. The name Al-Batra means the rock. Now, the route shown here is the full Exodus route proposed by Glenn Fritz, shown in blue. Now, I have overlaid where I believe the Israelites rested on each Sabbath of the journey, shown in yellow circles. Now, while the tradition can only be traced back so far, I believe that the Israelites were given the law at Mt Sinai on the Feast of Pentecost. Now, Pentecost can be between 7 and 8 weeks after Passover. Now, immediately following the Passover on the Hebrew calendar comes the Unleavened Bread Festival, which goes for 7 days. Pentecost is counted from the Sunday during that 7-day Unleavened Bread Festival. Now, in my theory, I have the Sunday on the last day of that festival, which would give them 8 weeks to get to Mount Sinai. The first direct mention of the Israelites being told to keep the Sabbath occurs a month after the Exodus, when God first gave them the manna halfway into the journey. Now, I believe they were keeping it prior to it as well, as God had directly told them that while they were still in Egypt to keep 2 special Sabbath days. In Exodus 12:16, while they are still in Egypt, God tells them when they keep the Unleavened Bread Festival that there is to be a Sabbath on its first day and on its 7th day. Now, they left Egypt on the first day of this festival. Now, their hours of walking on that first day was an exception to the rule, as they were quite literally fulfilling the meaning of that festival in coming out of Egypt. Now, since they were already commanded to do so, they would have rested from all work on the 7th day of the festival, 6 days after they left. Now, our first time marker on the Exodus journey is 1 month later, when they reached the wilderness of Sin, noted in Exodus 16 verse 1. Now, it would have taken them at least a week to get to where Glenn Fritz places the wilderness of Sin from the Red Sea crossing site, and then at least a week to get to Nawaiba from Etham, given the narrowness of Wadi Watir. So this leaves only 2 weeks to go from Ramses, their starting point, to Etham. So Etham is about 2 weeks from Ramses. The only encampment that we're told about in the Bible in between is Succoth. So in my opinion, that must have been where they kept the 7th day of the unleavened bread festival. They would have had about 8 days at most to go from Succoth to Etham. Now Glenn Fritz calculates the distance between the traditional Succoth and Etham as 11 to 12 days. Now that to me is too great a distance to travel for the estimated pace calculated for the rest of that first month's travel. So, as a result of that, I propose that the traditional Succoth was not the Succoth of the Exodus journey. Now, while there was a city called Succoth, there is good evidence that it was also the name of the nome or region of the Sinai Peninsula. The name Succoth simply means a tent or tabernacle, so theoretically anywhere on the Sinai they pitched their tents would fit the name of Succoth. Now in my theory, I have placed Succoth halfway from Ramses to Etham. Now, given the lack of encampments between Ramses and the Red Sea crossing, I believe that the first weekly Sabbath and the 7th day of the Unleavened Bread Festival fell back to back over a whole weekend, which they kept at Succoth. They were then at Etham for the 2nd Sabbath and at Nawaiba for the 3rd Sabbath. Now, if they went to the traditional Succoth 3 days from Ramses, stayed there for 3 or 4 days, and then had enough time to get to Etham, that would have given the Israelites at Kahun enough time to catch up with the main body of Israelites at Succoth. However, as I've just demonstrated, that doesn't appear to have been what happened. So those Israelites at Kahun would have had to have caught up with them later on the journey. So they may or may not have crossed the Red Sea, perhaps going straight to Mt Sinai. Now, on the other hand, any Israelite slaves at Serebet, at the copper mines there, could have been escorted to a rendezvous with the main body at Etham. Now, after their camp at the Red Sea and the crossing, there were 3 days to Marah, and then another few days to Elim, where I place the 4th Sabbath on the journey. Now, my theory has the first day of the Unleavened Bread Festival falling on a Monday. Therefore, 1 month later would fall on a Wednesday, when they entered the wilderness of sin. You then have the provision of quail late that week, then followed by the provision of manna. Now, they would have reached Dophkah for the 5th Sabbath, and then reached Rephidim for the 6th Sabbath after a week-long ascent up to the plateau behind the coastal mountains. Now, Lush, which is about 2/3 up the ascent, may have been a half-day rest to help recuperate from the arduous climb up to the pass. And they then reached Sinai by the 7th Sabbath with a week to prepare for the giving of the law. Now, it's a theory, and I'm not dogmatic about it, but it does logistically work in my opinion. So, that wraps up the Exodus route in a nutshell. Thanks for watching the video.